Today we're joined by a panel of experts who will consider the future of the West Midlands and provide some insight from their respective disciplines on that particular subject. So our esteemed panellists today are Paul Woods, who's a planning director at the aforementioned Woods Hardwick, and he's going to be presenting today as well as joining the panel. We've got Brenton, the head of land at Mulberry Homes. We have Maria Dunn, the Head of Development Policy at Birmingham City Council. And last but not least, we have Trevor Ivory, who's a partner at DLA Piper. Paul will be first up to provide a state of play presentation, which will outline how the region is shaping up in the current extraordinary context that we find ourselves in. And then following that, we'll get each panelist to introduce themselves properly and provide one insight or two insights on the question at hand before we move into a Q&A session. Talking of Q&A, you can submit your questions in writing using the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom panel of this particular of your particular screen, or you can raise your hand. If you do use the raise hand function, I will bring you onto stage, the virtual stage, and ask you to put your question to the panelists. Should be noted, we are recording this session, so if you've got something controversial to ask that you don't want to go into the public domain, don't ask it. But we will only be circulating the recording with the permission of our speakers. So if they put their foot into their mouth, it won't be going out too widely, and you'll get an exclusive insight into what they think about this particular subject. So we're looking to wrap up the session by 10:25 a.m. this morning. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Paul Woods. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Oliver. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for joining us this morning. As Oliver said, my name's Paul Woods. I'm a planning director at Woods Hardwick, and I lead the planning team within our Birmingham office from the Fort Dunlop building. So what I wanted to do was set some context for the debate, touching in particular on housing targets and land supply and local plan coverage, particularly for the West Midlands Combined Authority area. Oliver's going to then come in and talk about some research that ECF have done with respect to current consent rates in the region. I'm then going to talk about opportunities to increase delivery, some of the challenges and opportunities, and then touch on economic recovery for the region and how that's looking for the next few years. So just to start with then some context, as many of you may know, West Midlands was, along with London, the fastest growing region in the UK pre-COVID, with a GDP of 2%. But the region's reliance on the automotive, manufacturing, tourism industries, as well as universities, leaves it somewhat vulnerable since these sectors have been particularly affected by the virus. And as an illustration of this, the latest information for the ONS indicates that the West Midlands showed the largest negative growth in GDP in quarter 2020, which is the latest information broken down by region. Confirmed with the same quarter earlier, so that's a 5.3% reduction. So shows the challenge, I suppose, for the coming year. So what's in term for the medium term? I hope to frame the debate reference to growth ambitions in the region at the time of the devolution to the West Midlands Combined Authority, how it's performing and what might lie ahead. So again, to provide some context, as many of you may know, West Midlands Combined Authority came into effect on the 17th of June 2016, and it's focused on the three LEP areas of Greater Birmingham Solihull LEP, Black Country LEP, Coventry and Warwickshire, plus Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin. It's made up of constituent and non-constituent authorities, with the constituent authorities having full voting rights, non-constituent having more limited, but still important to the operation of the combined authority. So Andy Street was elected mayor in the 4th of May 2017, and the first devolution deal was signed in November 2015, and then a second devolution deal at the time of the budget in November 2017, which covered housing, skills, digital technology and other matters. So at the time of the second devolution deal, there was a housing package signed by government and the combined authority, and it set out ambitious growth targets for the area. And the combined authority entered into commitments. And one of those was to deliver 215,000 new homes by 2030-31. And those are to be delivered by the constituent and non-constituent authorities. And it represents an increase in delivery to nearly 16,000 units a year from an average of 12,000 over the previous 3 years. So quite a hike. And that target is set above the government's local housing need assessment is set out in the NPPF. There's also a commitment to review local plans and commitment to progress those to adoption as necessary by the end of this year. Alongside that, there's a package of funding of £350 million, subject to those commitments being progressed. So how are they doing? How's the region doing? These are the government statistics for net additional dwellings. And you can see this graph was reported to the Combined Authority Housing and Land Delivery Board last January and sets out the position at that time. And you'll see in 2018-19, nearly 17,000 new dwellings were added. And that represents a 15.8% increase on the previous year, total of 14,628. And it exceeds the combined authorities' trajectory in order to meet their target by 2030-31. The most recent published data indicates that for 2019-20, 16,529 dwellings were delivered. It's not shown on this graph since those figures have been published since the last report to the Housing and Land Delivery Board. But again, you can see it's above trend. And so the last 2 years have been seen successful delivery, although the figures do run to March, so the full effect of the virus may not have been accounted for. So it'd be interesting to see what this year's figures show. So here's the breakdown for those figures, and these are the constituent and non-constituent authorities within the combined area. I suppose, as you'd expect, there's some fluctuation between the various authorities, some up, some down on last year, but broadly it's still above 16,000, it's above 16,500 there. So that success in the last couple of years has been instrumental, I suppose, in the combined authority successfully securing additional funding from government, which I'll come on to later in the slides. We've also done a little bit of work to provide a snapshot of 5-year housing land supply figures relating to, again, to the constituent and non-constituent authorities. This is based on latest published data by the local planning authorities themselves, and you can see base dates ranging from 2018 up to last year. The 5 of the 16 are currently unable to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply. Sandwell faring the worst at the moment, followed by Redditch. Just gives an indication, I suppose, as to where the issues lie across the region. This slide, I wanted to touch on this. This relates to the Greater Birmingham Black Country housing market area, which Maria may be able to expand on. But I suppose the key point here is that through that housing market assessment and a strategic growth study undertaken in 2018, there was an indication of shortfall in the Birmingham area, in so much as the city can't meet its housing need of 37,900 in the period 2011 to 2031. And that need was to be taken up by neighbouring authorities through the duty to cooperate. It also covers the Black Country area, which is currently subject to review, but you can see there's a shortfall there of 29,260 in the period 2019 to 2038. So following the growth study, there was a position statement published last year in July, and what was the shortfall of 16,325 has actually markedly improved, such that the shortfall is 2,597 now, and that's principally been through additional capacity coming forward within the city itself from unidentified sites. But the position is not so great for the Black Country. You'll see that it's still a shortfall up to 2031 of 7,485, but more markedly, the majority arise in 2031. And that's currently being considered through the Black Country Plan Review, which is currently underway. I just sort of reference Coventry and Warwickshire housing market area as well, since again, the Coventry area has a shortfall indicated in the Coventry local plan in 2017 of 7,800 dwellings over the period up to 2031. So again, that needs to be met through neighbouring authorities through the duty to cooperate. So this slide gives an indication of local plan coverage for the combined authorities area. And as many of you be aware, that the government guidance is that local plans have to be kept up to date every 5 years. And there is, there's obviously, as I referred to, there's a commitment within the combined authority to progress plans as appropriate up to the end of this year. More widely, the government is indicated that local plans should be adopted by 2023, and that was a commitment emphasised again by the Minister for Housing this week in an announcement. So of the 16, 8 plans have been adopted in the last 5 years and are up to date, there's 12 or so authorities that are at various stages of review. The combined authority put a report to the Housing Delivery Board in November last year. The combined authority is in regular contact with all the local authorities, and they did express some optimism that the target agreed in 2018 can be achieved through confirmed adopted plans, although clearly the lockdown has had an impact on some of these plans, but local authorities are taking positive steps. So, but there's still a lot to do. I mean, on the basis of the table, you can see that various stages of review that will need to be progressed during the course of this year. Some of you will be familiar with the government's method for calculating housing need, and that was subject to, changes were subject to consultation last year. The government made an announcement on the 16th of December that it was keeping its standard method, but with an additional 35% uplift on 20 of the most populated and urban areas in the UK. And those include Birmingham, Coventry, Stoke-on-Trent and Wolverhampton in the West Midlands. So the intention for the government is to focus on brownfield land and other underused urban sites with a view to maximising existing infrastructure. And it's expected that local authorities in those areas need to meet the need themselves rather than surrounding areas through duty to cooperate, unless it would conflict with national policy and legal obligations. So there is a transitory period for authorities where they're already at Regulation 19 stage, that's publication stage. They may submit their plans under existing method within 6 months of the announcement. But I suppose the telling point is that for the local authorities affected, they wouldn't be subject to that transition period. So you can see the impact of what the new 35% does in respect of current adopted plan requirements and the most recent phases of delivery. So for Birmingham, for instance, there's 1,979 additional dwellings per annum on current targets between 2018 to 2030. Coventry, 1,025 on current targets. Stoke-on-Trent, less so, 105, and Wolverhampton increase of 497. So clearly quite a significant impact. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I think this is where I now intervene. So thanks for that exposition really on where policy is at and where targets are at in the West Midlands. And one of the things that we try to do as a consultancy is to paint the picture in terms of what's going on the ground. So you can have as many policies and as many targets as you like in planning terms, but what are your committee doing? What are your planning committee doing in terms of consenting schemes to actually allow starts to proceed and units to be delivered? So colleagues of mine, and it's been a bit of a labour of love, I have to say, have reviewed consent rates, planning committee consent rates for the constituent members of the West Midlands Combined Authority across the course of the past year to find out how much has been consented, what level of affordable housing is being consented, how many times a committee goes against an officer's recommendation, and the average number of units that they are consenting per application. And what our analysis has found is that Birmingham is doing the majority of the heavy lifting in terms of planning consents in the region. Over the past year, almost 10,000 units have been consented across 46 different schemes. So there have obviously been some large-scale schemes and some smaller schemes. And what we did was analyse schemes of 10 units and above, because that's when affordable housing requirements start to kick in. A distant second was Telford and Wrekin, and they've consented almost 900 units over the course of that period. And Wolverhampton, surprisingly, is a distant last. It didn't consent a huge amount of development in the period that we considered. So it'll be interesting to see how that sort of interacts with deliveries and starts over the course of the coming months, bearing in mind the obligations it's likely to face in the coming years. I've got a couple of charts as well, just to sort of illustrate how many schemes have been determined over the course of the past year. And this is for residential schemes of 10 or above units. And you can see that Birmingham, as I said, is doing a huge amount of the heavy lifting here within this particular part of the world. So we've got Maria on. We can pat Maria on the back because there's a lot going through that planning committee. This is the total number of residential schemes across the piece. And again, you can see that as expected, Birmingham's doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but some of the authorities that you would anticipate would be consenting huge numbers of schemes are not really. So the likes of Coventry, Wolverhampton, really arguably are not yet putting their weight in terms of the consents that are actually being delivered. So I'd be interested if there's anyone on the call from those particular authorities to find out what's going on there. And we also looked at the average level of affordable housing associated with the consented schemes that go through committee. And you can see there's a very, very sort of fluctuating picture. So we actually found in Telford that that is the highest level of average affordable housing that's being delivered at the moment, but on a small number of units. Birmingham is hovering around the 20% mark at the moment, and maybe Maria can talk to that. But you know, the picture is very varied across the region at the moment. And if anybody wants more research, we have looked at the non-constituent members of the West Midlands Combined Area Authority as well, and we've also got lots more data. So if you are interested in looking at that report, get in contact with me and I can circulate it to you afterwards. And I'm going to hand back over to Paul.
Thanks, Oliver. So how are we going to deliver more housing? Well, the Combined Authority came up with a land delivery action plan in 2017, which builds on work that they commissioned from the Land Commission, which reported in February. A lengthy report, but I've just picked out, you know, some of the key initiatives, I suppose, against which they're moving forward. So the first one was a single agreed vision and to produce a spatial expression, in inverted commas, for the West Midlands and a spatial investment plan for the West Midlands industrial strategy. the combined authority doesn't have a plan-making authority as such, like the London Mayor, but clearly it is responsible for inward investment, and an overarching strategy is important in that regard. Identified action zones to prioritise significant development sites, including review of housing potential with strategic transport corridors, unity of purpose, so the establishment of a housing and land delivery board and a growth company. So delivery board up and running, as I've alluded to, and the West Midlands Growth Company was set up in February 2017. So that's moved forward. A programme to transform brownfield land at a much greater pace and scale, engaging locally and with national bodies in the assembly and remediation development of brownfield land. So that's an ongoing programme for the authority. However, interestingly, the Commission acknowledged that the release and development of greenbelt land is likely to be required, and that local reviews risk a piecemeal and unsustainable approach. So it noted that in response to the strategic growth study for the housing market area that I've just mentioned, need for a consistent greenbelt assessment methodology across the 3 LEP areas. Yeah, okay, thank you. Move on. So challenges and opportunities then. I've just picked out a few points, I suppose, which might inform the debate. There's the impact of the new standard method, increased pressure for housing. So where is the housing going to go? I mean, clearly there is a successful programme of bringing forward brownfield sites within the West Midlands, but to what extent that can continue to meet housing need. I've touched on the Greenbelt Review, but that's at odds with the Mayor's commitment, or rather Greenbelt pledge to protect the Greenbelt. So he's very much focused on bringing forward brownfield sites in the first instance. Trevor may touch on this, but there's the impact of government changes to the planning system. As many of you may know, government consulted on a planning white paper in August last year, and I suppose that has some uncertainty for plan making going forward, albeit that we understand a planning bill is due to be produced towards the end of this year, so things will hopefully become clearer. There's a cost of delivery of brownfield sites, so it's heavily reliant on public investment and intervention. So opportunities, as I see them, there's obviously a whole issue around town centres and the need to repurpose those. Again, some of you will be aware that the government's currently consulting on new PD rights for change of use from Class E commercial to residential, and that may open up opportunities to repurpose some town centre sites for residential development. The combined authority has a number of task forces in hand, and there is a town centre task force focused specifically on that issue, set up in June 2019. Opportunities for increased density around planned public transport and infrastructure investment. So we've talked HS2 in particular in the longer term, example of that being the hub in Solihull, which is focused on Birmingham Airport and the new HS2 station interchange. And there is a proposal there for Arden Cross, where we've got a 340-acre site for a new mixed-use quarter, if you like, for the West Midlands as part of their vision for 2030. And government funding, which continues to come through, as shown on the next slide. So I've talked about the housing deal. These are just some examples that I've pulled out of recent successes the combined authority has had in terms of securing government funding. So in July last year, you see there was 84 million from the New Deal announced by government, 66 million from Getting Building Fund, part of the build strategy of the government. The Chancellor's Comprehensive Spending Review in November last year, the Mayor estimates that's £1.2 billion worth of investment is going to come through that. Principally 800 million to be spent on public transport projects through the 5-year intra-city transport settlement, and 250 million to secure the UK's first gigafactory to produce car batteries, which is important for the West Midlands given its focus on the car industry. And more recently in December, there's 24 million from the Urban Transport Fund and further 27 from the Land Fund, which is part of the housing deal. So other reasons for optimism, I've talked about ongoing infrastructure investment, so the completion of the Metro, Birmingham Metro second phase to Edgbaston, and the guarantee of HS2, I think, are key drivers of change over the medium to long term. Many of you will be aware we've got the Commonwealth Games coming to Birmingham in 2022. Coventry is the UK City of Culture, due to run from May this year through to May 2022. I think there's a strong collaboration in the West Midlands between public and private sectors, and the combined authority is very, let's say, on the ball as far as economic recovery is concerned, and they had a paper go through to committee in September last year for an economic recovery strategy and implementation plan. So that's a result of close working relationships across the authorities, LEPs, and various advisory groups and task forces. So that's due to become a live public facing document, which will hopefully lead the region out through to recovery. Part of that strategy is a new town centre living regeneration strategy for town centres. That again was endorsed by the Land and Planning group within the combined authority in September. And the Mayor's Green Recovery Plan, which is building on commitments to make West Midlands carbon neutral by 2041. So grounds for optimism. Hopefully that's helpful in setting the scene, and I'll pass back to you, Oliver.
Thanks, Paul. That's great. Super. So at this stage, I will entice our participants to submit their questions, get their hands up, because we're now moving into the next phase of the proceedings where I bring in each of our panelists. So I think the first panelist I'm going to go to put him on the spot, Arthur. If you unmute yourself, Arthur, he's smiling away. Just, Arthur, if you could, would you be able to just introduce yourself, your organisation, and also provide one key insight into what you think will shape the future of the West Midlands moving towards 2025?
Thank you, Oliver. I'm Arthur Brenton. I'm head of land for Mulberry Homes, which is a Rugby-based residential house builder, part of a group of companies that also specialise in commercial development, land promotion, and a number of other mixed uses. So as a business, we currently deliver about 300 homes a year out of our Rugby office. So we're sort of placed to sort of capture that part of the market. In terms of the presentation that Paul's put together and some of the key points there, I think you've got to appreciate that we've had 12 months of chaos with COVID. The sales market has remained strong. We've continued to build houses, sell houses. There is market demand for them, but I think you'll find that purchasers' aspirations have changed, their requirements have changed, and I think they are very much minded to a post-COVID lifestyle. People are going to want to have a bit more space. They don't want to live in a cramped urban environment with no open areas. People are very conscious of that green space and the prospect of having to work from home. So we're certainly seeing as a driver, purchasers' demands for the type of housing that they want to be in and the locations that they want to be in. So I'm not disputing any of the numbers and data that Paul's put together there. And on paper, that all looks great. But will people want to live in the urban areas of Birmingham, Coventry, Wolverhampton, or will they want to live on the suburban parts of those towns and cities where they can feel a little bit more space to breathe? That may well have an impact on the delivery numbers that the authority have been tasked with. So I think that's, you know, as a single snapshot, I think that could very much affect the way that those numbers are translated from the theoretical land supply to delivery statistics. So that's one thing.
Thanks, Arthur. That's brilliant, and we might well come back to that particular insight. And we've got Maria on the call. Nobody's going to want to live in Birmingham, Maria, potentially. So can you make the case? But we'll come back to that. So Maria, I'm going to hand over to you now. So same question, really. Just provide a little bit of information about yourself, but also, what's your key insight? And you don't necessarily have to respond to what Arthur's just said.
Good morning. I'm Maria Dunn, Head of Development Policy at Birmingham City Council. I've worked within planning policy in the wider West Midlands since 2006, and I moved to my current role in January 2020, so just before the world went mad with COVID. For those of you who don't know, Birmingham is the largest local authority in Europe and the largest city outside of London. We've got a population of just over 1 million, and that's a very diverse population, and it's a very young population. The local economy is supported by 5 universities and 6 major colleges, so that does provide a large pool of graduates to try and retain within the city. In terms of the big challenges, I think COVID-19 has obviously presented significant health challenges, and it's brought into focus the future role of cities. I think in the short term, we've seen a significant decline in visitor numbers as people work from home and shop more locally, but I feel that there is a significant future for the city and that cities will bounce back. I think people's desire to socialise, enjoy culture and share experiences will drive that resurgence of the city centre. I think one of the other big issues which has come to the forefront recently is the need to tackle climate change. Birmingham City Council declared a climate emergency in June 2019, and we are committed to achieving net zero carbon as fast as reasonably possible. This is a huge challenge, and planning and development do have a considerable role to play in delivering this ambition. And I think some of the points that have been raised present us challenges in terms of how we live more sustainable lives, balanced against the desire for people to have more space. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. That's great. And noted your point on cities bouncing back. So I think we're definitely going to have that conversation in a bit. Trevor, over to you. Same questions.
Thanks, Oliver. Hello, everyone. I'm Trevor Ivory. I'm the UK Head of Planning at DLA Piper. We are a global business law firm, but I'm based in Birmingham. We're very proud to have our office in Birmingham. And indeed, in a few months' time, we'll be moving into shiny new offices in Birmingham. So I, for one, am very much the view that talk of the death of the office is very much exaggerated, with 40,000 square feet of new space being fitted out as we speak in the Paradise development in Brum. I think for me, as Maria has said, yes, clearly we've had some real challenges in the region as we have globally over the last year or so, and Brexit also having an impact alongside COVID. Apologies, someone had to mention it first, so I've got the B word out of the way. But for me, I think the fundamentals of the region are still very strong, and I think there is an opportunity for us to come back from this stronger perhaps than we went in. I think looking at the trade aspect and the Brexit aspect for a moment, I think we have, as a region, always been very globally focused. We have good trade links, not just with Europe, but with the rest of the world. The region is very proud, and rightly so, that it is, I think, the only region in the UK that has a trade surplus with China. All of that means that actually I think we're well placed as the global economy starts to pick back up. We're well placed to play our part and to see that growth return. I think in terms of what's fueling the growth at the moment and what will continue to be important, for me, infrastructure is key. And I think we cannot underestimate we shouldn't underestimate the impact that HS2 has had. Decisions that's clearly influenced decisions for the likes of HSBC to locate their UK headquarters here, PwC, soon to be my neighbours in Paradise. They have taken a decision to invest in Birmingham because of HS2, I think, in a significant part. So that continuing investment in infrastructure, I think, is going to be key to driving growth. And that, coming back to housing where Paul began, that infrastructure is critical. Making sure that the right infrastructure is delivered at the right time to support that housing growth, I think is important. And I think we need to think about what infrastructure means moving forward. Immediately we think of roads, rail, and transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, but actually, one of the things I will be looking at, Arthur, when I'm looking for my next move is what's the quality of the broadband link to my house, which probably wasn't a factor before, but I think we need to think about some of that infrastructure that supports the digital economy, that is going to support that remote working, that is clearly going to be a part of all of our futures moving forward, even post-COVID.
Brilliant, thanks, Trevor. And yeah, we've done some work historically with a company called City Fibre, who are rolling out full fibre broadband infrastructure across the country. And I think that sort of comment will be music to their ears. And I know there are lots of providers in that space looking at the West Midlands as well as other parts of the country. I'm going to stick with you, Trevor. We didn't touch on this in the answer that you just gave, but looking forward to 2025 and what's going on at Westminster at the moment, what do you think the impact of the government's planning reforms as currently slated are likely to have on delivering growth in the region?
I think it's a big question, and I think there are a number of answers depending on when you're looking at. I think experience tells us that there is always a danger when fundamental reforms are made to the planning system, in that it inevitably leads to a period of uncertainty and a bit of a hiatus. And we saw that with the changes in 2004 that were introduced by the Labour government. We saw it again with the Localism Act, and then the NPPF when the coalition and then Conservative governments were changing the system. So I think that there is a danger in the next few years that we see a backward step on delivery as local authorities have to go back into rewriting the rules yet again, coming up with yet another local plan, complying with it, and understanding how to work within a whole new system. So I think there is an immediate danger. Longer term, what will those changes do for growth? I think that's very unclear as far as I can see. I think the changes are fundamental. Too often governments claim they're making radical change, and then the change is underwhelming. But if the changes look anything like those set out in the white paper, then there is a fundamental change. But I think there's a lack of detail in that white paper, and I'm sure that's part of the process, isn't it? It's the beginning of the consultation. But I think until we see the detail, there's a question in my mind as to whether we'll see an increase or not. Certainly, I thought it felt as if there was a warning bell ringing, for me at least, in the context of the recent changes to the standard methodology. For me, one of the positive changes, one of the things that really has driven growth, has been that linking of affordability to housing and the numbers that need to be delivered. I think we can spend planning inquiry after planning inquiry arguing about housing need and such like, but ultimately you can cut through a lot of that by looking at affordability and linking where the affordability issues are greatest. That would indicate a strong need. And I think that moving away from affordability in the recent changes to the standard method potentially has adverse impacts on delivery in those crucial areas where affordability is particularly acute.
Perhaps in the later discussion, we might discuss why some of those changes have been made and talk about some of the change in personnel in Westminster and in Number 10 and why certain decisions have been made. Okay, I'm going to turn back to Maria. Maria, you would have seen from obviously the presentation that Paul put together and our slides on consent rates that Birmingham is doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of housing delivery in the region. So where do you think the growth in the city is going to be in the next 4 years' time? You haven't exhausted all your supply yet, have you?
No, and actually going back to the point that Arthur raised, Birmingham City Council is about much more than Birmingham City Centre. So I think, we do have the opportunities to deliver some of that suburban growth as well. So Birmingham continues to deliver a significant amount of housing. Our average delivery across the last 5 years was 3,249 units net. That's above the Birmingham Development Plan target, but obviously falls short of the new figures that are coming out of the government's revised standard methodology. The city centre continues to be a focus for development, and you know, the numbers in the graph that was in the presentation, I think a lot of that is stemming from significant applications coming through within the city centre. But we do have a number of other significant sites and opportunities which will deliver housing. So we've got the Langley Sustainable Urban Extension, which is still to deliver. Perry Bar Residential Scheme, which is of course on the old Birmingham City University campus, and all of the opportunities around there. Longbridge and challenging brownfield sites such as Port Loop, which we're seeing come forward. Sites like Port Loop take a long time to deliver, so we're really pleased to be seeing that coming forward.
Great, thank you. And lastly, I'll turn to Arthur before heading into some audience participation. So get your questions in if you can now. But Arthur, in the coming years, you know, in your area around land acquisition, what do you think that's going to look like in the next 4 years? Where are the sorts of, without giving too much away, where are the sorts of areas of interest, and you know, what are the dynamics in the marketplace for the next four years or so?
I think following on from what I've said, there's pent up demand from house builders over the last 12 months. There have been new entrants into the region, into the market. We're seeing new regions pop up from mainstream developers. We're finding developers spreading and growing. There's obviously demand for housing. It's whether the supply can be, you know, levied at the same rate to meet that demand. If it can't, then what you find is that the competition for sites is incredibly strong. Land prices get pushed high. Landowners think that's great. Not disputing that, but it puts risk on developers taking views on things, pushing schemes perhaps beyond where they ought to be, which has a knock-on effect with the detailed consents that start to be seen by authorities. You know, you're talking about number of units being pushed, space being compromised, and that perhaps conflicts with the point I was making earlier about aspirations of purchasers who want, potentially in a post-COVID world, to have that little bit more room to breathe. So I think there could well be some conflicts on that. Maria is absolutely correct. I didn't mean to suggest that Birmingham is purely the
I put words into your mouth. I put words into your mouth on that one.
The quarter-mile radius from the bull ring, that is not my understanding at all. However, yeah, inner city brownfield sites are very complex. They're very costly to redevelop. They take time. And yes, you can get a consent for a large number of units that on paper says you're going to be delivering something good, but it could take a long time to be realised. The same is said of urban extensions. You know, they're great at producing numbers, but infrastructure leading is a big burden. It costs a lot of money to put that infrastructure in. It results in a scheme that often, due to viability, delivers you less affordable housing, which, again, you talk about affordability, potentially is not helping. So there's going to be a continued emphasis, I'm afraid to say, that whilst authorities will want to run their plan-led system and bring forward these sites, and absolutely we support that, there will still be a legacy of 5-year land supply applications, consent by appeal, because your delivery is not meeting the target numbers, and there'll be a mixed bag, absolutely. But as I said at the start, there's underpinning demand for housing. You've got developers who are in in that sector that want to be building, and as long as somebody keeps bringing sites through the system, they will be developed. They just might not be quite what everybody around this table thinks that they should be, and how they should come across. But we'll certainly see that over the next couple of years. Certainly don't think anyone's going to take their foot off the accelerator in terms of the development process.
Is there, beyond Birmingham, are there areas in the region that you would tip? Maybe I'm asking too much about your strategy here, but is there an area potentially that you would tip as somewhere that you anticipate seeing growth within the next 4 or 5 years at all?
Well, I think Paul picked up on it on his presentation. Authorities like Coventry have significantly underperformed in that respect. Strategically is very well located with infrastructure, but requires further infrastructure investment to release the development sites that have been identified for the last how many years. And they're complex. And as I mentioned, with sustainable urban extensions, they require investment. They require land assembly. They require somebody pulling the strings to make it all happen. And quite often, that isn't the case. There's missing bits within the process. Things get delayed, and ultimately you don't get things moving as quickly as you'd like. In terms of other localities, there's plenty within the region that could very easily accommodate additional supply, and there's as I said, there's demand for it, but ultimately it's sort of getting all the pieces of the jigsaw together at the same time, because you can have demand in one place but no supply in another but no demand. It's about leveling that out across the region, not just focusing on one authority or one city as a main hub.
Great answer. Okay, thanks, Arthur. That's really, really helpful. So we're going to move into audience questions now. So we've only had one submitted, so get your questions in. And Paul, I'm putting you on notice that I'm expecting you to ask a question at some point within the next 10 minutes or so. So get your thinking cap on. The first question comes in from Matt Forden. This is in reference to a scheme that Maria talked about. So Port Loop is seen as a massive success. Why do you think that is? And I'm going to add another question on top of that. What are the key learnings that can be taken away from that project that investors, developers, planning consultants can learn for future similar schemes like it? So that's to you, Maria, and you're on mute. There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, I think Port Loop's seen as a big success because it's taken so long to come to fruition, and also because it's very different and ambitious around type of construction. So we've got the modular homes there, and I think it is very different, and hopefully it's a catalyst for that area to change and to deliver further housing growth.
It's a good question on modular. Okay, let's take that modular question. How critical do you think that's going to be in terms of delivery moving forwards? And I'll get that, particularly in this region, and I'll ask that to all of the panelists. But I'm first going to put it to Arthur as a developer. Arthur, how much is modular factoring into your strategy moving forwards?
For us as a business, modular isn't factoring into our strategy at all. There are some developers who are embracing it, specialising it, and rolling it out in a number of locations. And there are plenty of us that are not. Modular is not the only answer to achieving the sustainability agenda. It's a solution. Is it the right solution is another question. It's being rolled out, as I say, in a number of authorities on certain sites, but it doesn't wash with every authority's aspirations of what a house should look like and be like. Certainly if you go perhaps slightly further east and further south, into perhaps into the Cotswolds, into the Chilterns, etc., the local authorities certainly wouldn't entertain a modular site unless it was one that they were bringing forward specifically as an eco town, eco city, because the whole concept of them doesn't wash with their aspirations of the local vernacular. In a brownfield site, in an urban area, yes, you can introduce it in a lot more of a free running way, but I think there's always going to be conflicts within that. As I say, some developers are very quick to embrace, others are not, and you're sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't. You want to tick the box from the sustainability argument, but equally you've got to get a planning consent that the planning officers will support, and not everyone is on the same page in that respect.
Trevor, is that your experience as well in terms of modular? Is it the right solution, as which was the question that Arthur posed? You know, is that reflective of what you've seen?
We've seen a contrast in different approach between different types of client, I think, and Arthur's right. I think I'm not seeing as much of a move to modular in sort of traditional greenfield house building, but where we've seen really a huge amount of investment in it, I think, has been more for our investor clients who are very much looking at, for example, build to rent, those sorts of schemes, the more urban schemes, the high density schemes. There's some real appetite in there to look at modular and look at how that can help to deliver quicker and with more cost certainty in terms of putting that together. And actually, when you look at it, it's come a long way, it seems to me, as a product from when probably the housing associations were first to start playing with it. It can provide a real quality product, and it continues to impress me quite how high you can go with modular. That seems to be pushing it as well. But yeah, there's a divide between different types, and certainly it's the build to rent or the more urban student, some of the more specialist forms of accommodation that are really, I think, pushing it at this stage.
I think then Tom Ryan's just put something interesting into the chat, that there's modular being delivered on a greenfield site in Northstowe, just outside of Cambridge. Do you think, Trevor, that there is a prospect that the market might move towards, you know, in more greenfield, leafy areas, that there might be a move towards modular?
I'm sure there will be, and yes, I didn't mean to say that there was none. There's less in that sort of more traditional house building, but I think there are a number of drivers of it. The sustainability aspect is important. The cost aspect is important, and so I think, yeah, we will continue to see that push out. I think there will always be, as Arthur says, some locations where it just doesn't work. I'm thinking particularly where you've got heritage issues, or if you're in sensitive landscapes, AONB or wherever, then it may be that those design factors push in a different direction. But more and more, I think, as the product develops, as that sector matures, I think they will overcome a lot of those challenges, and we will see more rather than less moving forward.
Indeed. Okay, thank you. And Maria, putting the question to you in another way, how much of the stock being delivered by 2025 do you anticipate being delivered in a modular fashion?
I don't know, to be honest. I think, you know, as the panel have established, it's not appropriate everywhere, but I think we will increasingly see developers move towards it in order to try and address the sustainability issues, but not all developers. So I think, you know, it's going to play a role, but how significant that is, we don't know yet.
And just to reiterate Trevor's point about broadband, your bandwidth went low for a minute there, so we need to get a full fibre connection into your household as soon as possible. We'll do what we can for you. I'm going to put another question to the panel that we've had in via Q&A. So this one's for everyone, but I'm going to start off with Paul, actually. So the question is, for all panellists, would it be beneficial for the West Midlands Combined Authority to be granted statutory planning powers on the same basis as Greater Manchester and the Greater London Authority. This is a question that always comes up, I think, in discussions about the West Midlands. Paul, you've got experience across the piece. What would be your view on this topic?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. I think it would be advantageous, let's say, to have a spatial plan across the West Midlands. I mean, there's a lot of issues that we've discussed, where the housing is going to go, for instance. We know there's a lot of need in the cities that can't be accommodated. So it needs, I would suggest, a spatial approach so that those conflicting matters can be addressed, including, a comprehensive review of the Greenbelt where that's required. I mean, interestingly, I think the Mayor sort of has mentioned in the past in discussions I've had that it's not necessarily essential to have plan-making powers, but given the other powers that the combined authority has, but whether that changes, I suppose, over the next few years, we shall see. But I think generally this issue about housing more generally across the UK and the conflicts about where it should go, I think does need a more wider spatial approach.
So statutory planning powers, the way that I would understand that would be not just in the plan making field, but also you see what they have in London, which is the Mayor has the ability to call in applications and effectively overturn a local authority's decision. Would you like to see the West Midlands Mayor given the same powers?
I think that's for debate, isn't it? To the extent to which the power is held by the Mayor, I can, obviously works as an approach in London. Whether it's directly transferable to the West Midlands, what one would need to think about. I suppose for more strategic schemes, then it could be beneficial.
How about you, Trevor? What's your view on the topic?
I think Paul's already made the point. If Andy Street was sitting on this panel, he would tell you that he doesn't need statutory powers. He can work behind the scenes, and to an extent that's true. But I think for me, one of the things that some of the reforms we've had over the last few decades of planning, one of the things that we've missed is that strategic level of planning. And I think whether that was structure plans or whether it was regional strategies, or whether it's linked to the combined authority in the way the London plan is, but that there is a gap without that, and some of the tough issues that we see in this region and the Greenbelt is the ultimate tough issue. I'd have thought in a planning context, actually having a single decision maker who is able to take a holistic view across the region or across the authority area, I can see real benefits to. I think the duty to cooperate, to my mind, has its faults. The current proposals suggest removing the duty to cooperate. I'm not clear what they're proposing to put in place, but they're a real.
Have we lost it? Have we lost Trevor? I think we have momentarily. Okay, Trevor, we've lost you momentarily. So I'm going to move the question on to Arthur. Arthur, you have a scheme somewhere in the West Midlands and the nasty local planning committee has refused it. Would you like the West Midlands Mayor to have the power to call that site in and approve it for you?
Powerful reasons, I think, is a good, particularly where your boundaries, having that ability, better broadband, it might tend to go.
Okay, Trevor, we think we've got you. I think we missed you for about 2 minutes there, so I'm not quite sure what happened. But I've just posed a question to Arthur. Arthur, I'll bring you in, and then I'll bring Trevor back in. Hopefully, his broadband's recovered. So, Arthur, your answer to my question.
Right. So, I think on some level, yes, I would support having an overarching plan maker, policy maker, and ultimately somebody who could determine across with an understanding of the whole region at the same time. as we pull right back to Paul's presentation, you've got some authorities who are being proactive. They're on the ball with their new plans. They're bringing things through. They're delivering on their numbers. They're up from last year, etc. You've got others who aren't. And if you have a scheme in one of the authorities that is performing and there is a duty to cooperate, and you're able to, a scheme is countered by an authority that isn't, you've got to be able to see the picture as a whole. To have a scheme refused and be able to have it called in by somebody who can see that, I think would be beneficial in the right context. I don't think it's necessarily the right answer for every site, and I wouldn't want to necessarily see the planning system taken over and it be a unilateral decision from one person on every occasion, because that's what will end up happening. People will be arguing that every site will be argued against, because this authority is doing well, this authority is not doing well, we've got to spread the burden. There's going to be a point where somebody does have to step in, and it probably is on the more strategic large scale developments, but that's not to say that there won't be examples of smaller scale local development that warrants that intervention, because it delivers on one level but conflicts against something somewhere else. And certainly we've seen historically, you've got professionals within the authority, officers who are qualified to look and consider schemes, supporting them. You've got committees who've got completely different agenda that don't really care. They're not interested. They don't want to see development, irrespective of whether there's a need, whether they believe the numbers or not. And rather than having to introduce pins at every opportunity and bring forward development through appeal, having somebody that has a vested interest in that area who can step in and go, actually, I don't agree, look at it in the round, I think would probably be worthwhile. But it's going to be a sensitive discussion point, and there's going to be no right answer in that respect.
Well, we know Andy Street doesn't want the power, so there you go. Trevor, if you can recall the last 30 seconds of your answer, give me a nod, and then I'll hand over to you. If not, I'll go straight to Maria.
Actually, my last 30 seconds was making the point you've just made. I think one of the dangers, whilst I can see many reasons why you do it, I think one of the dangers from a political position is that I think what the mayor has done quite well is to sort of stay above party politics. He's brought together some very different political makeup authorities and has delivered some good stuff as a result of breaking down those barriers. I think there is a danger that if you start to step too far into the planning world, you immediately get dragged into some of that more party political, local political stuff that you were just talking about and that Arthur was just mentioning. I think that was my last point. Whether it was worth me saying again, I'll leave others to decide.
Absolutely was worth it, definitely worth it. Maria, I'm going to hand over to you and probably flip the proposition a little bit and say your planning committee has just refused a scheme, maybe against an officer recommendation. How do you feel if you got the mayor of the West Midlands calling in a scheme and overturning that decision?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question, isn't it? And I think, we have an appeals process in place already in terms of the development management side of things. I think on the policy side, the duty to cooperate has been very challenging in terms of its implementation and its workings. And I do agree we miss strategic planning. I think we need some sort of mechanism whereby we can look at cross-boundary issues. And I think we also need to remember, which the white paper doesn't seem to be clear on, that cross-boundary issues are about more than housing need. So being able to look collectively across a region or a functional area and thrash out the planning issues at that more strategic level, I think is really important. However that's done, be it through the duty to cooperate, or a refined duty to cooperate, or some sort of return to regional planning.
That was an incredibly diplomatic answer, I have to say. Very bravo. I'll just put an alternative. We always in this country look to other comparisons in England around decision making. We do a lot of work in Australia, and if you look at what happens in New South Wales, for instance, what they call state significant development gets determined, and that's any development over a particular threshold gets determined by the New South Wales government. So the New South Wales government serves the purpose as the strategic sort of planning authority on large scale developments, and then the smaller developments are determined by local councils. What tends to happen is local councils are fairly toothless in terms of their planning function, and the vast majority of work goes into securing consents via the so-called state significant development route. So it would be interesting. I personally, I don't think that would be an approach that would work in England, because local authorities have such a role in determining applications at the moment. To take that away would be very controversial. But there's another example of a system that works on the other side of the world.
Oliver, can I just come in there? I think we have a similar approach in terms of infrastructure.
Yes.
With the DCO regime and development over a certain threshold falling into that regime. There are some interesting options there in terms of delivering some of that larger scale, particularly the urban extensions, the new settlements, actually whether DCO offers a way through. And it's interesting that is in the government's white paper as an option. And I think there are some lessons for some of that bigger, more strategic housing delivery that we can draw from Australia, but also sort of from our own infrastructure regime, which has, I think, broadly worked well. The problem with it does come back to that politics. It's removing that decision-making function from local authorities in housing, which is so emotive, is a big call, I'd have thought, for any government.
Absolutely. And it'll be interesting to see whether those provisions stick. So, Paul, I did put you on notice. So have you got your question prepped for the panel?
Yeah, I suppose one thought is, again, going back to the white paper, it seems to me it's the new proposals coming forward are going to put a lot of pressure on local authorities, particularly with respect to plan making, the need to effectively adopt plans within a 30-month period from commencement. And there's a number of changes of approach. And I suppose I'll be interested in the panel's view, but in particular Maria's, in terms of how planning departments are prepared to respond to that, I suppose, by way of challenge, and how under pressure planning departments are at the moment, and where that additional resource is going to come from. Maria, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I think that there are lots of challenges. Firstly, I'd throw back perhaps to other members of the panel, collectively across the industry, if every local authority was trying to progress a local plan at the same time on the same time frame, and all of the agents had to submit their call for sites to all the local authorities at the same time and respond to local plan consultations at roughly the same time, and all of the statutory consultees were trying to do that, do we think that the resources would be there across the sector and that the system would hold up? But I think from local authority side, we very much have suffered from budgetary cuts, from staffing cuts, and we would struggle to. I think the white paper suggests that certain elements of plan making could overlap or move more quickly. We would really struggle to ramp that up without additional resource. So as you say, unless there's extra resource put into planning, but then even with the money, if all the local authorities in the country are trying to do the same thing at the same time, there's a limited pool of planners to draw upon. So whereas we might bring in particular contract workers or temporary workers for a period of time, that relies on different local authorities being under pressure at different times. So for me, I think while speeding up plan making is a good thing, putting it making it so rigid that we're all trying to do the same thing at the same time, whilst it has advantages in terms of potentially ironing out some of those issues like where the growth should go, I don't think the system could hold up at the moment.
I saw pound signs in Paul Woods' eyes when you were talking about local plans running at the same time. So I think he nodded and was upping his fees by about 20%. Arthur, what do you about that question directly that Maria's posed? How would you guys as developers feel about a process where local plans are all running in parallel, and you'd be quite busy, wouldn't you?
Well, Woods Hardwick would certainly be very busy, and I think Paul, you're absolutely right to say that Paul's rubbing his hands with glee, because as Maria points out, if every authority was trying to do the same thing on a similar time frame, the world would go incredibly busy for that period. The resource that's there would be overstretched, and not knocking the likes of Woods Hardwick and DLA and others. There's a finite resource within consultancy and agents for calls for sites and representations. A lot of that resource has been pulled out of local authority over the last how many years. You've still got to have somebody in the authority to actually respond and do the work, as Maria points out. So there is a real risk that if we pushed the button and everybody had to have their plan in place by the same date, no plan would be in a fit state. It certainly wouldn't pass any tests because it wouldn't have been put together in a robust fashion. You'd have a cyclical situation where you have loads of development in one hit because everything becomes allocated and potentially consented at the same time. Then you sit on nothing for the next 10 years until the next plan is due to go. The fact that they do all overlap allows for the development industry to spread itself and jump from one authority to another, from one site to another. Otherwise, we'd all burn ourselves out, and it would be massive boom and bust. And I don't think that's an appropriate or sustainable way of the industry maintaining itself. Because you have a good year, the shareholders want another good year the next year, and then they want a better year the year after, and we're into this issue of snowballing, which can't be sustained if everybody's doing it at the same time.
Trevor?
Yeah, I think it comes back to the comments I made at the beginning of this session. Change to the planning system always creates delay. It always makes us take a step back. Whether we then take a step forward depends on the reform, but it always results in a drop in delivery. And you can see that throughout the endless radical reforms that we've been faced with over many years. And I think so. I would caution about rewriting the system. The irony is actually the system is starting to work. The housing numbers are increasing. We are seeing higher numbers than we've seen for a long time. And just at the point where it's starting to work, we're now talking about rewriting the rules again. And it seems to me actually that evolution rather than revolution is where I would prefer to see us going. I think that there are clearly things we could do. The system still has its issues, but refining the system we've got feels to me like it will be much less of an interruption and would enable us to keep moving forward. So I'm always reminded, Eric Pickles, for those that remember, Eric Pickles famously said that he was going to get lawyers out of the planning system and we were all going to be handing back the keys to our Maseratis, was the phrase he used. Yeah, I still don't own a Maserati, but I'm probably closer to owning it after his reforms than I was before. And that is inevitable. And some of the changes, we will end up with yet more challenges over what the changes mean, what the process is. So I would caution any government looking at that radical change just to think about whether it's really radical change that's needed, or actually just continuing to improve the process that we're all already familiar with and that is already running.
Brilliant. I think that's a series of really interesting perspectives on that particular question, actually. And there are lots of issues that have been raised that will be particularly poignant in terms of the West Midlands specifically. I do have one more question that I'm going to ask via the Q&A function, but the last question I'm going to end on, and I'm just going to give you a heads up on it, is looking forward to 2025. We're in the West Midlands. You know, how will we be describing the region in 2025? One sentence. I'll ask you all. What would you like to say about the West Midlands in 2025? What would you like to be said about it? But the question that I'm going to put before I get to that one is from Hilary Bell, who said, should the members of planning committees be required to have a good understanding of design standards, planning and conservation? So it's quite a general question. Again, it's one that comes up regularly. So I'm going to change it slightly and put it to Maria. Maria, in your experience in a local authority and with planning committee members and councillors in general, do you find that they do have a good understanding of design standards, planning and conservation? Do you think that's changed over the course of the last few years?
Well, firstly, I must confess that I haven't worked in development management directly, but I think every authority I've worked in has required our elected members to undergo planning training before they can sit on planning committee. So our members are trained. Every authority I've worked at, the members are trained in those issues. We've done that internally with officers, and we've done that externally with consultants. So I think, you know, it is important to remember that members do have that training. Yeah.
And Trevor, do you find in your experience, I don't know how much you interface with planning committees per se, but do you find that there is a good standard of knowledge, amongst elected members, and has that improved in recent years?
I think that Maria started her answer with a confession. I'll start mine with a confession. I have been a councillor, although I wasn't brave enough to sit on planning committee, but I have been a councillor. So I've seen it from both angles, and I think, in fairness, the local government association and local authorities spend a lot of time training members of planning committee. So I'm not sure training is always the issue, although sometimes I accept it looks like it might be. But I think we always have to reflect as an industry. No councillor gets elected in order to carry out a quasi-judicial function on a planning committee. They get elected because they're passionate about their local community, because they've got a particular view on things. And they find themselves thrown into this process where the lawyers are poring all over their decisions and looking for legal robustness. Actually, that's not, they're not elected to uphold the local plan. They're not elected to uphold the national planning policy framework. They're elected to represent the views of their community. So I think sometimes that isn't an excuse for bad planning decisions by any stretch. But I think sometimes what looks like poor training to us, who can see it's a barking mad decision, actually what it is a decision based on the fact that we've asked politicians to make this decision rather than lawyers or planners or specialists. We shouldn't be that surprised when we get a political decision as a result.
Will you be standing for public office again? Can we break an exclusive?
No.
Oh, well, there you go.
I would encourage everyone to do it once. It's an insight into the system to be on the other side as those involved in planning. But yeah,
okay.
Do it once.
Well, then, Arthur, have you stood for public office? Are you going to stand for public office?
I haven't stood for public office. There is no intention to stand for public office in the immediate future. I guess Trevor's answered that perfectly in some respects. You know, I'm not disputing that training is given to councillors. It does when you're sitting there as the developer with a proposal that they don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand what's put in front of them. They're not listening to the expert advice of their own officers and completely ignore that and make a decision that you really scratch your head and go, how have they decided that there's 5 new reasons for refusal that have never been mentioned before, but because Mrs. Biggins in number 38 said that her cat got run over, there must be a traffic safety issue. That's what we on the development side of things see. And yes, that's an extreme sort of case, and we joke about it, but you know, they're not there to consent development. They're there to, as Trevor says, to represent their constituent members, their local communities, and often the agendas that they were elected on are completely contrary to development policy, and therefore, there's always going to be that conflict. Which, again, coming back to the previous question about should there then be somebody who potentially has an overarching view of the region, of a greater area, it opens up that question. Somebody who is perhaps has the vested interest of the whole rather than the small part, maybe they do have an influence. But I'm certainly not going to put myself forward to sit on the planning committee, having sat in the dock the other side.
Fair enough. And without doing the sales pitch, it's always good to have community engagement specialists on your projects who understand about the politics of a local area. Paul, you obviously interface quite a lot with planning committees. How are you finding it currently? Is it still a frustrating exercise, or has it improved, particularly in the West Midlands over the course of the last few years?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. Well, I mean, it will vary, won't it, from local authority to local authority. I think every committee makeup is different, and there will be local politics involved. I think, taking Maria's point, training is important for members so that they're aware of what their duties are on the committee. But I think I'd also point to the relationship between officers and members, and the extent to which they have a good working relationship and respect for each other, because I think often if members have respect for officers and their view, then they'll take a considered approach, let's say, to an application. I mean, there will be occasions, obviously, when other pressures come to bear in terms of the politics that might be involved in a major decision, but I think generally our system works well. I mean, in terms of the democratic process and consideration of what are important issues for local people, and I think it's right that ultimately members have to say on significant schemes.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask that question that I trailed earlier. Trevor, I'm going to start with you. So we're looking forward. We're in the West Midlands in 2025. In a sentence or so, how would you like the region to be known?
I would like to see us building on the strengths we've already got. I would like to see us being a very outward-looking region, very globally connected. I would like to see us continuing to lead in those areas where we have a genuine excellence as a region, advanced manufacturing, professional services, and those sorts of things. So I would like to see us continuing to drive UK PLC forward, really, and playing that role that I think the Midlands is best placed to play in really driving forward Britain post-Brexit and post-COVID.
Brilliant, thanks, Trevor. Maria?
Yeah, I'd like to see the region really embracing the green agenda and starting to be at the forefront of reducing carbon emissions and recovering from COVID in terms of a move to the green economy.
Brilliant. Arthur?
I think picking up on both Trevor and Maria's point, I do see that the West Midlands as a region can stand up and deliver upon the challenges that it had presented itself, the numbers that they bought into under previous policies, etc. But as Maria says, it's an opportunity to embrace the green agenda, changes to building regs that come in 2025. If the region embraced that as a whole and everybody bought into the same philosophy, you wouldn't have the disparity between areas within the region and disparity between one developer's approach and one authority's approach. If everybody was buying into the same scope, it would look a very different place. And I think that's a challenge that could be embraced and delivered in that time frame.
Brilliant. And Paul, I'll give you the final word.
Well, thanks, Oliver. I think coming back to my presentation, the government's got big plans for the Midlands engine, and I'd like to see the West Midlands back to one of the or the fastest growing region in the UK economy, pre-COVID, picking up on all the points that the panelists have made.
So you might say you'd want that to be a Maserati engine, hey?
Yeah.
There we go. So what a note to finish on. So I think we'll conclude there, and just to say, terrific discussion. Thank you ever so much to our panelists, Trevor, Maria and Arthur, for participating in this joint ECF Woods Hardwick webinar. Thank you to everybody that's attended. I don't think anything too controversial has been said, so we may well distribute the recording after this. And just to finalise and say thank you ever so much for coming.